Have you ever had the feeling of seeing too much, of noticing what nobody talks about, of feeling what others seem to ignore? If so, maybe you belong to the silent minority of deep thinkers, those whose consciousness is more of a magnifying glass than a filter. But is this a gift or a curse? We live in an age of excess noise, excess speed, excess stimuli that push us out of ourselves all the time. And in the middle of all this rush, introspection has become almost a subversive act, something you need to steal from your own time, because the world isn't going to give you that space. For those who think deeply, for those who feel intensely, living in this reality is like trying to breathe underwater. It's discovering that you're tuned into a different frequency, living in another layer of existence, and that this way of being isn't exactly welcome in the world we live in. There's a curious experience that some people live through and others don't even know exists, which is perceiving too much. You're in a regular conversation, everyone talking about everyday things, and suddenly you notice a tension in the air that nobody else seems to feel. You hear what wasn't said. You see what's hidden behind the words. You feel the weight of what was left hanging. And then you wonder if you should say something, if you should point out the obvious that only seems obvious to you. But you already know the answer. You already know that if you do that, you'll create unnecessary awkwardness. You'll break something that maybe was better left intact. So you stay quiet. You observe. You carry alone what you perceived. And this is just one among hundreds of situations like this that happen every day. Situations where you see more than you should, feel more than would be comfortable, think more than would be practical. It's as if you were born with a type of emotional and intellectual radar that simply doesn't turn off, that picks up signals all the time, that processes layers of meaning that most people completely ignore. And this isn't a choice. It's not something you decided to develop to feel special. It's simply how you work. It's your natural way of being in the world. Deep thinkers aren't the majority. They never have been. And maybe they never will be. The truth is that most people live in a more automatic mode, more immediate, more focused on what's tangible and practical. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying it's better or worse. I'm just saying it's different. There's a layer of existence that's functional, that solves problems, that keeps things moving, that takes care of what needs to be taken care of. And that layer is absolutely necessary. But there's another layer, a deeper layer, where questions without easy answers live, where everything is denser, more complex, more ambiguous. And some people simply can't avoid living in this second layer. They try. Sometimes they try really hard. They try to be lighter, more carefree, more normal. But it's like trying not to hear a sound that's playing too loud. You simply can't turn it off. And then you realize you're living in a kind of silent minority, a group of people that exists, but rarely recognizes itself, because each one is too busy trying to survive in their own internal world, trying to make sense of a consciousness that never rests. This expanded consciousness, this ability to see beyond the obvious, to feel beyond the superficial, is sometimes called a gift. People say it's a blessing to be sensitive, to be deep, to be able to see what others don't see. And maybe it is, in some moments. Maybe it's beautiful to be able to perceive the hidden beauty in small things, the complexity of human emotions, the depth of a conversation that goes beyond the trivial. But the inconvenient truth is that most of the time this doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like a burden. It feels like something heavy that you carry alone, something that separates you from others, something that makes you feel tired in a way that's hard to explain. Because it's not just seeing, it's feeling the weight of what you see. It's not just perceiving, it's carrying the responsibility of what you perceived. And nobody taught you how to do this. Nobody gave you an instruction manual to deal with a mind that never stops questioning, analyzing, searching for meaning in everything. We live in a world that wasn't made for introspection. It was made for movement, for speed, for constant stimulation. You wake up and there are already notifications waiting for you. You open social media and you're bombarded with images, opinions, information. You spend the whole day jumping from one task to another, from one screen to another, from one superficial thought to another superficial thought. And at the end of the day, you're exhausted, but you don't really know why. Because you didn't do anything that required depth. You just kept yourself busy. And that's exactly what the modern world does to us. It keeps us too busy to think, too fast to feel, too distracted to really be present. The noise is constant. The speed is relentless. The stimulation never stops. And in the middle of all this, Introspection has become almost an anomaly, a subversive act, something you need to steal from your own time because the world certainly isn't going to give you that space. For those who think deeply, for those who feel intensely, this lack of space for introspection isn't just inconvenient, it's suffocating. It's like you're trying to breathe underwater. You need silence to process what you're feeling. You need time to make sense of your own perceptions. You need quietness to hear your thoughts, but the world doesn't stop screaming, doesn't stop demanding, doesn't stop pulling you out of yourself. And then you discover that living introspectively in a world that only values extroversion and visible productivity is almost impossible. You discover that to be yourself, to honor your nature, you need to swim against the current all the time. You need to say no when everyone else is saying yes. You need to stop when everyone else is running. You need to go inward when everyone else is going outward. And this puts you in a position of permanent conflict, not necessarily with others, but definitely with the structure of the world you live in. Living on a different emotional and mental frequency isn't a pretty metaphor. It's a concrete and often painful experience. It's as if you were listening to music that nobody else is hearing, paying attention to details that nobody else notices, feeling things that nobody else seems to feel. And it's not that other people are less intelligent or less sensitive. It's that they're simply tuned into another station. They're living at another rhythm, with other priorities, with another way of processing reality. And you can't change stations by your own will. You can't simply decide to feel less, think less, perceive less. You're stuck on this frequency, and the only thing you can do is try to find other people who are tuned into the same place, which is rare, extremely rare. And meanwhile, you live this constant feeling of watching life from the outside, as if you were in a transparent bubble, seeing everything, but never really being part of it. Seeing depth in a world that works on the surface has a price, and the price isn't small. You develop a rare sensitivity, an ability to perceive nuances that most people ignore. And this could be wonderful if it didn't come accompanied by an internal dialogue that never rests. Because you don't just see, you analyze what you saw. You don't just feel, you question what you felt. You don't just live, you reflect on what you lived. And this process is exhausting. It's like having a second layer of consciousness working all the time, commenting, interpreting, searching for meaning, creating connections, raising doubts. You watch a movie, and while everyone else is just enjoying the story, you're thinking about the symbolism, the narrative choices, what that says about the human condition. You have a conversation, and while the other person already forgot what was said 5 minutes later, you're still turning over every word, every pause, every facial expression, trying to understand what really happened there. Lucidity, this ability to see things as they really are, without comforting filters, without illusions that soften reality, can be an unbearable weight. Because when you see things as they are, you see the hypocrisy, you see the superficiality, you see the emptiness that many people try to fill with consumption, with entertainment, with infinite distractions. You see that most conversations are nothing but noise, that most relationships are based on convenience, that most people are just playing a role they learned to perform. And you can't unsee this. Once you've seen, you've seen. Once you've understood, you've understood. And now you need to live with this knowledge. You need to find a way to exist in a world that suddenly seems much more fragile, much more fake, much more sad than you'd like it to be. The suffering of perceiving what isn't said is perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of this experience. Because people don't say what they really feel most of the time. They say what's socially acceptable, what's expected, what won't cause problems. And you, with all your sensitivity, with all your ability to read between the lines, you catch what was left out. You feel the sadness the person is hiding behind the smile. You notice the anger they're disguising as indifference. You notice the pain they're pretending not to feel. And what do you do with that? Do you speak? Do you point it out? Do you offer help? Most of the time, no, because you've already learned that people don't want to be seen that way. They don't want anyone to notice what they're trying to hide. So you carry this perception alone. You live with the dissonance between what's being said and what's really happening. And this creates an extra layer of loneliness, because you're seeing a reality that nobody else is seeing. You're dealing with truths that nobody else wants to acknowledge. If you're enjoying this content, maybe you'll also like our exclusive material that's in the first pinned comment. And here I need to pause to say something important, something that's often ignored when we talk about sensitivity and depth. Not romanticizing this experience is fundamental. There's a tendency to transform sensitivity into something poetic, into something beautiful, into something that makes you feel special in a positive way. But the truth is that most of the time this has nothing poetic about it. It's anguish, it's chronic doubt, it's constant displacement. It's feeling like you don't fit in anywhere, that you're always a little out of place, a little out of tune, a little uncomfortable. It's waking up in the middle of the night with your chest tight because you're thinking about existential questions that have no answer. It's spending hours turning over in your head a conversation that lasted 5 minutes. It's feeling a weight in your chest that you can't explain, a diffuse sadness that has no specific cause, a feeling of emptiness that seems to have no end. The existential isolation that comes with this way of being is real. It's deep, and it's extremely difficult to communicate to someone who doesn't live it. How do you explain to someone that you feel alone even when surrounded by people? How do you describe this feeling of living on a different planet, where nobody speaks your language, where nobody understands your references, where nobody shares your concerns? You can't. You simply can't. And then you learn to keep this to yourself. You learn to smile and wave and pretend everything's okay. Because trying to explain only makes things worse, only makes you seem dramatic, pretentious, too complicated. So you live through these dark nights of the soul, these moments when you question everything, including the validity of your own experience, these periods when you wonder if maybe you're just neurotic, maybe just exaggerated, maybe just someone who thinks too much and feels too much and complicates everything unnecessarily. The question that always comes back, the question that haunts you, is simple and at the same time impossible to answer. Is it possible to live with depth without being devoured by it? Is it possible to maintain this sensitivity, this ability to see and feel intensely, without it destroying you slowly? Is it possible to find a balance between honoring your nature and surviving in a world that wasn't made for it? I don't know if there's a definitive answer to this. Maybe the answer is different for each person. Maybe it's something you need to discover alone, through trial and error, through a lot of suffering and a lot of learning. But what I know is that the question itself is already important, because it acknowledges the paradox. It acknowledges that this isn't easy. It acknowledges that there's no magic solution. And then we arrive at the central paradox of this experience, which is the paradox of the sensitive person. On one hand, you have a deep desire for connection, to be seen, to be understood, to find someone who speaks your language, someone with whom you don't need to pretend, someone who understands without you having to explain. On the other hand, you have an equally deep need for withdrawal, for solitude, for space to process everything you feel and think, for time to be with yourself without the pressure of having to adapt to others' expectations. These two needs are in constant conflict. You want to get close to people, but at the same time, you need to distance yourself. You seek intimacy, but you're afraid of exposing yourself. You want to belong, but you don't want to have to modify yourself for it. And this oscillation is tiring, it's confusing, and it often makes you feel unstable, as if you didn't know what you really want, as if you were always in doubt about what the right decision is. The difficulty with superficial dialogues isn't being fussy. It's not intellectual elitism. It's simply incompatibility. It's like trying to use a 3-prong plug in a 2-prong outlet. It doesn't fit. You're at a party and someone starts talking about something trivial, something that has no depth at all. And you try to participate. You really try, but you feel like you're faking it, like you're playing a character, like you're there but not really present. And it's not that you think you're better than these people. It's not that. It's that you simply can't connect with conversations that don't go anywhere, that don't touch on anything meaningful, that just fill the silence without creating any real bridge between people. You need conversations that have substance, that touch on issues that matter, that create a true exchange, and these conversations are rare, extremely rare, and when you don't find them, you feel empty. You feel like you're wasting your time. You feel even lonelier than if you were literally alone. The search for meaning is constant for those who think deeply. You can't just live. You need to understand why you're living. You need to find a purpose, a direction, something that makes it all worthwhile. But at the same time, you deeply distrust easy answers, ready-made formulas, anything that seems to oversimplify the complexity of existence. You want meaning, but you don't want illusion. You want direction, but you don't want to deceive yourself. And this is a very thin line, a line you need to walk very carefully, because it's easy to fall to one side or the other. It's easy to get lost in nihilism, or to cling to a belief that doesn't withstand scrutiny. So you live in this uncomfortable space between seeking and doubting, between the desire to find something solid and the fear of deceiving yourself. And this keeps you in a state of permanent tension, in a state of restlessness that never completely resolves itself. This oscillation between approach and withdrawal defines much of your relationships. You approach when you find someone who seems promising, someone who might understand, someone with whom you can be yourself. You open up, you share, you create an intimacy that's rare and precious. But then you notice something that bothers you, or you feel like you exposed yourself too much, or you simply get tired of the effort that any relationship requires. And then you withdraw. You distance yourself. You return to your internal world where it's safe, where nobody can disappoint you, where you have control over everything. And this pattern repeats many times throughout life. And you don't know if this is a flaw of yours, if it's something you should try to fix, or if it's simply your way of being, your way of protecting something that's too precious to be exposed indiscriminately. A lot of this starts in childhood. The roots of deep sensitivity are usually there, in those first years when you were just trying to understand the world, and at the same time trying to survive in it. And surviving for a child isn't just a physical matter. It's emotional. It's psychological. It's finding a way to deal with things that are too big for your understanding. For some children, the answer was to develop a rich internal world, a shelter made of thoughts, of imagination, of reflections that nobody else could see. This internal world became the safe place, the place where you could be yourself without fear, where you could process everything that was happening out there in a way that made sense to you. And the more you took refuge in this internal world, the more it grew, the more complex it became, the more important it became. The lack of emotional nurturing in childhood doesn't need to be dramatic to be significant. It doesn't need to have been abuse. It doesn't need to have been severe neglect. It could have been just a lack of attunement, an inability of the adults around you to really see you, to really understand you, to validate what you were feeling. It could have been parents who were too busy, too stressed, too worried about their own issues to pay attention to yours. It could have been a family that didn't have space for intense emotions, for difficult questions, for the complexity you already showed from an early age. And then you learned that what you felt wasn't welcome, that what you thought was too much, that you needed to contain yourself, control yourself, adapt. You learned to keep things to yourself, to process alone, not to expect anyone to help you make sense of what was happening inside you. Childhood as territory of effective hypervigilance is something that deeply marks who you become. You learned early to read the environment, to perceive changes in adults' moods, to anticipate conflicts, to adjust as necessary to keep things safe, not to create problems, not to be a burden. You developed a keen sensitivity to what wasn't said, to the tensions that hung in the air, to the subtle signs that something wasn't right. And this wasn't a conscious choice. It was a survival strategy. It was the way you found to navigate an environment that was unpredictable or emotionally unstable in some way. And this hypervigilance, this ability to perceive minimal details, stayed with you, became part of your way of being. And now you carry this to all your relationships, to all situations, without being able to turn it off even when it's no longer necessary. The emotional radar you developed is powerful, but it's also heavy. You walk into a room and immediately pick up the vibe. You feel who's comfortable and who's tense. You perceive the power dynamics, the unspoken alliances, the hidden conflicts. You see children who grow up in environments where they need to be adults before their time, children who need to emotionally care for their own parents, children who learn that their function is to keep the peace, not create waves, not be too much. And these children become adults who perceive tensions that nobody else notices, who feel the weight of conflicts that haven't even started yet, who carry an emotional responsibility that nobody asked them to carry, but that they don't know how to let go of. Observation instead of reaction becomes your default mode. You don't act impulsively. You don't respond without thinking. You observe first. You analyze. You try to understand what's happening before deciding what to do. This can seem like wisdom, and in a sense it is, but it's also a way of protecting yourself, a way of keeping distance, a way of not getting too involved until you're sure it's safe. And the more you observe, the more you see. And the more you see, the more you realize it's better to keep observing. Because acting, exposing yourself, trusting, always has a risk, and you've been hurt enough to know it's not always worth it. This sensitivity, this ability to perceive and feel intensely, ends up being a force that turns inward. Instead of being expressed externally, instead of being shared with the world, it stays circulating inside you, creating this dense and complex internal universe. You don't scream when you're angry, you reflect on the anger. You don't cry immediately when you're sad. You observe the sadness. You try to understand where it comes from, what it's trying to tell you. And this creates a distance between you and your own emotions. A distance that can be useful sometimes, but that can also make you feel disconnected from yourself, as if you were always analyzing instead of simply living. Internalization isn't cowardice, although many people might interpret it that way. It's not weakness, it's not inability to deal with the external world. It's a legitimate form of defense. It's a survival strategy that worked when you needed it most, and that now is part of who you are. The withdrawal, the movement inward, is where you find safety. It's where you can process everything without interference. It's where you can be completely yourself without needing to explain or justify yourself. And the internal world you built, this world made of thoughts, memories, reflections, creations, becomes your true home, the place where you really live, while the external world is just a space you visit when necessary. This internal world is rich, it's vast, it's full of nuances and layers. It's like a library where each book is a memory, a thought, a possibility. It's like a gallery where each painting is an emotion, a perception, a truth you discovered. It's like a theater where you can rehearse different versions of yourself, different ways of responding to the world, different ways of existing. And all of this is valuable, all of this is precious, but it's also lonely, because nobody else has access to this world. Nobody else can see what you see in there. Nobody else can really share this space that's so important to you. The clash between this rich internal life and the pace of the modern world is inevitable and brutal. The modern world values productivity, efficiency, visible performance. It values those who do, not those who think. It values tangible results, not internal processes. It values speed, not depth. And you, with all your need for time to reflect, for space to feel, for quietness to process, you simply don't fit this model. You're slow when the world wants speed. You're deep when the world wants surface. You're introspective when the world wants extroversion. And this puts you at constant disadvantage, makes you feel like you're always behind, always falling short, always failing to be what's expected of you. Delicacy, sensitivity, depth are seen as flaws in a world that values toughness, practicality, objectivity. Nobody's going to praise you for feeling deeply. Nobody's going to give you a promotion for thinking in complex ways. Nobody's going to value you for perceiving nuances that others ignore. In fact, these characteristics will probably get in your way, will make you seem slow, complicated, difficult to deal with. You'll be seen as someone who thinks too much, who complicates things, who can't simply do what needs to be done without questioning everything. And this creates a constant feeling of displacement, of not belonging, of fighting against your own nature just to try to fit into a world that wasn't made for you. This displacement doesn't pass with time, doesn't improve with age, doesn't magically resolve itself. You can learn to deal with it better, can develop strategies to navigate the world without losing yourself completely, can find niches where you feel a little less out of place, but the basic feeling remains. You continue feeling like you're in a world that speaks a different language than yours, that values different things than what you value, that works on a logic that doesn't make sense to you. And this is tiring, it's frustrating, it's draining in a way that's hard to explain to someone who doesn't live it. The social paradox of the deep thinker is that you're constantly surrounded by people but rarely feel truly connected. You're in groups but as a silent observer, someone who's physically present but absent in some other way. You hear the conversations but don't fully participate because what you'd have to say would seem out of place, too dense, out of context. You watch people laughing, having fun, connected in a way that seems easy and natural for them, and you don't understand how they do it, how they don't get tired of the superficiality, how they don't miss something deeper. You ask philosophical questions in a world that works on autopilot. You wonder about the meaning of things while everyone else is just doing what needs to be done. You question the structures, the conventions, the unwritten rules, while everyone else simply accepts them and moves on. And this puts you in a strange position, because you're not being contrary on purpose. You're not trying to be difficult. You genuinely don't understand how people manage to live without asking themselves these questions. How they manage to accept everything at face value without questioning anything. And when you try to share these questions, when you try to bring depth to a casual conversation, you notice from people's looks that you said something wrong, something that shifted the energy, something that made everyone a little uncomfortable. The desire for communion is always there. This wish to find someone who understands, someone with whom you can be completely transparent, someone who sees the world in a similar way to yours. But along with this desire comes the fear of getting hurt, because every time you opened up in the past, every time you tried to truly connect, you came out a little wounded, a little more convinced that maybe it's better to keep your distance, maybe it's safer to stay in your internal world where nobody can disappoint you. And then you oscillate between these two poles, between the hope of connection and the fear of vulnerability, never feeling comfortable in either place. Virginia Woolf understood this in a visceral way. She wrote about thinking too much as having skin that's too thin, as if you didn't have the layers of protection that other people have, as if everything hit you in a more intense, more painful way. For her, the silent room wasn't a luxury, it was a survival necessity. It was the only place where she could exist, without having to constantly defend herself from the world, where she could think without interruption, where she could feel without needing to explain herself. And she also knew the danger of this, knew that there's a point where you can lose yourself in your own internal world, where you can distance yourself so much from external reality that you can't come back anymore. The risk of losing yourself in the internal world is real and needs to be acknowledged. Because this world can be so rich, so engaging, so satisfying in a way, that you can start to prefer staying there all the time, can start to avoid the external world not just when it's hostile but always, can start to create such a large distance between you and reality that you lose the ability to relate to it in a healthy way. You can become a prisoner of your own thinking, can start to confuse your internal narratives with reality, can lose the ability to distinguish between what's really happening and what you're imagining or projecting. When introspection turns into distortion, when deep thinking transforms into obsessive rumination, you enter dangerous territory. You start to create dense narratives about situations that might be simple. You start to project meanings onto things that might not have any meaning at all. You start to feed anxieties that are more creations of your own mind than reflections of reality. The world becomes a stage for your subjective suffering, and you lose the ability to see things in a lighter, more objective, more balanced way. Schopenhauer talked about the relationship between lucidity and suffering in a way that resonates deeply with this experience. For him, the more intelligent you are, the more capable of perceiving and understanding, the more you suffer, because you see with more clarity the flaws, the limitations, the fundamental absurdity of human existence. Ignorance works as protection, as a buffer that softens the blows of reality. And when you don't have this protection, when you see everything with implacable clarity, you feel everything in a more intense, more painful, more inescapable way. Intelligence and consciousness can mean the end of illusion, and illusions are comfortable. They're necessary for many people to keep functioning. You see the hypocrisy that sustains most social institutions. You see the emptiness that exists behind many conventions. You see that most people are just following scripts they learned without questioning. And once you've seen this, once you've really understood this, you can't participate in these conventions the same way anymore. You can't pretend you believe in things you know are false anymore. You can't behave as if certain things matter when you know they don't. And this separates you even more from others because you're seeing something they're not seeing, or that they're choosing not to see. The impossibility of unseeing is perhaps the most difficult aspect of this experience. Once you've seen, you've seen. There's no point trying to forget, trying to ignore, trying to return to a state of naivety you'll never have again. Consciousness is irreversible. Knowledge can't be erased. And now you need to live with what you know. You need to find a way to exist in a world that suddenly seems much more complicated, much sadder, much more absurd than you'd like it to be. But the internal world doesn't need to be just escape. It can be a bridge. It can be the place where you process reality to then create something valuable, something that connects you with the world in a new way. Introspection can be isolation, or it can be the fuel for creation, for art, for ideas that transform not just you, but also other people. Fernando Pessoa lived almost entirely in his internal world, creating heteronyms, entire universes of thought and feeling. And through this intensely interior life, he produced work that touched millions of people. Emily Dickinson barely left home, lived in almost total seclusion, but her poetry captured nuances of human experience that still resonate deeply today. Diving deep into the internal world and returning with something valuable is a possibility. It's a way to transform what could be just isolation into contribution, into legacy, into connection of a different kind. You don't necessarily connect with people day to day in a superficial way, but you can connect through what you create, through the ideas you develop, through the way you articulate experiences that other people had, but couldn't express. And this is a legitimate and powerful way of belonging, even if it doesn't seem like belonging in the traditional sense. Psychic isolation is different from simply being alone. You can be surrounded by people and still feel this isolation, because it's not about physical proximity. It's about true connection. It's about being seen. It's about actually sharing what you think and feel with someone who understands. The invisible loneliness, the loneliness that nobody perceives because you're always present, always participating, always doing what's expected of you, is one of the most difficult forms of loneliness, because it has no recognition, it has no validation, it exists only inside you. Living surrounded by people and still feeling invisible is a common experience for those who think deeply. You're there, you're participating, you're doing everything right externally, but inside you know that nobody's really seeing you, nobody's perceiving who you really are, nobody's accessing the parts of you that really matter, and you start to wonder if these parts even exist, if they have value, if someday someone will care about them, or if you'll spend your whole life hiding who you really are just to be able to coexist with others. The social masks you learn to wear are necessary to a certain extent, but they have a cost. Every time you adapt, every time you adjust your behavior to fit in, every time you hide a part of yourself so as not to bother others, you lose a little contact with who you really are. Constant adaptation as a form of survival fragments you, divides you into multiple versions, and after a while you don't know anymore which one is real. You don't know anymore who you'd be if you could be completely authentic. Identity fragmentation happens gradually, almost imperceptibly. You have one version of yourself for work, another for family, another for friends, another for social media, and none of them is completely false, but none of them is completely true either. Each one is a slice, an aspect, a calculated performance for the specific context. And in the middle of all this, you lose yourself. You forget who you are when nobody's watching. You forget what you really think and feel, because you spent so much time adjusting it according to what was expected. The high price of normalcy is precisely this. It's paying with your authenticity, with your integrity, with your connection to yourself. You manage to fit in, you manage to function, you manage to avoid conflicts, but you do this at the cost of who you really are. And there are times you wonder if it's worth it, if it wouldn't be better to simply be yourself and deal with the consequences, even if that means more loneliness, more rejection, more difficulty relating to others. Nietzsche talked about the conflict between the individual and the collective, about how tribal mentality, the desire to belong to the group, can crush individuality, can force you to conform, to become like others, to give up what makes you unique. And for those who think deeply, for those who feel intensely, this conflict is constant and visceral. You want to belong. You want to be part of something. You want to feel like you have a place in the world, but you don't want to have to betray yourself for it. You don't want to have to become something you're not just to be accepted. The desire to belong versus the need for authenticity creates a tension that doesn't resolve easily. You can choose to belong and sacrifice authenticity, or you can choose authenticity and sacrifice belonging. But choosing both at the same time seems almost impossible, because the world rarely offers spaces where you can be completely yourself and still be accepted, be valued, be seen as part of the group. The isolation you feel isn't from pride, it's not because you think you're better than others, it's simply tiredness. It's the tiredness of constantly adapting, of pretending, of hiding, of trying to fit into spaces that weren't made for you. It's the tiredness of talking without saying anything that really matters, of smiling when you're not happy, of being physically present but emotionally absent. After a while, you simply don't have energy for this anymore. You need to withdraw. You need to return to your internal world where you can breathe. where you can be yourself without needing to justify yourself. The society we live in rejects what's dense, what's deep, what requires time and attention to be understood. There's a fear of silence, a fear of reflection, a fear of stopping and really looking at things with depth. Silence is filled with noise. Reflection is replaced with distraction. Depth is avoided in favor of superficiality. And this isn't accidental, this is structural, because a society that values consumption, productivity, and conformity can't allow people to stop to question, to reflect, to see beyond the obvious. The excess of connections and the lack of intimacy define modern relationships. Everyone's connected all the time. Everyone has hundreds of friends on social media. Everyone's constantly in contact with other people. But how many of these connections are real? How many of these relationships have depth? How many of these conversations touch on something that really matters? The answer is very few. And for those who need true intimacy, conversations that go beyond the superficial, relationships that have substance, this scenario is frustrating and alienating. The isolation you feel isn't just yours. It's not just an individual issue. It's a social symptom. It's the result of living in a society that doesn't value depth, that doesn't create spaces for introspection, that doesn't recognize the importance of truly intimate relationships. And the more you realize this, the more you understand that your displacement isn't your failure, but an incompatibility with the structure of the world you live in. The more you understand that maybe the problem isn't you, maybe it's the world that needs to change. But the desire for belonging is inevitable because you're human, and being human is seeking connection, wanting to be part of something, needing others to make sense of your own existence. You don't choose to want to belong. This is in your nature. It's in all of our nature. The question isn't whether you want to belong. The question is how to belong without betraying yourself. How to find or create spaces where you can be yourself and still feel like you're part of something greater. And these spaces exist. These people exist, even if they're rare. True relationships, relationships where you can be completely authentic, where you don't need to pretend, where you're seen and accepted as you are. These relationships work like beacons. They remind you it's possible, that you're not completely alone, that there's someone out there who speaks your language. And maybe you don't need many of these relationships. Maybe one or two are enough. Maybe quality matters much more than quantity. Solitude, when well understood, doesn't need to be just suffering. It can also be a space for cultivation, for development, for inner strengthening. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the ethics of inner firmness, about building something inside you that nobody can take away, something that doesn't depend on external circumstances, something that sustains you even when the world around you is chaotic or hostile. And maybe that's what you need to do. Maybe that's what every deep person needs to learn, which is to build a center strong enough that you're not destroyed by your own sensitivity, so you can carry the weight of perception without being crushed by it. Clarice Lispector talked about the freedom of not belonging, about how there's a certain freedom in not fitting in not having to answer to others' expectations, in being able to follow your own path without worrying whether others will approve or not. And maybe that's the perspective you need to cultivate. Maybe that's what can transform your isolation from something just painful into something that also has value, also has beauty, also has meaning. You don't need to belong to everything. You don't need to fit into all spaces. You don't need to be understood by all people. Maybe it's enough to belong to yourself, to be faithful to your own nature, to honor your depth even when the world doesn't value it. Maybe it's enough to find one or two people who really see you, to create one or two spaces where you can be authentic, to develop a way of existing that's sustainable for you, even if it's not the way most people chose. And maybe, in the end, your displacement isn't a problem to be solved, but a characteristic to be accepted, a part of who you are that deserves to be honored instead of fought against. Maybe you're not broken. Maybe you don't need to be fixed. Maybe you just need to find peace with the fact that you're different, that you see the world in a unique way, that you feel in an intense way, and that all of this has value even when the world doesn't recognize it.